Thomas School of Pharmacy PharmacyChat. So we like to welcome you all. Today I have Dr. Joe Jackson and one of our students, Miss Alexia Carr, with us. So Dr. Jackson, I'm going to hop on over to you and have you tell us a little bit about yourself. So what year you graduated, where you're from, all of that fun stuff, and then we'll hop right on over to the pharmacy specific part.
Great. All right. Well, welcome everybody. I graduated in 1981, some time ago, maybe perhaps before all of you were born. I graduated with a PhD in what was essentially pharmacy administration from the School of Pharmacy there when it used to be at Fraser Hall. And I tried to get into the pharmaceutical industry in marketing in the worst way. I sent out probably 20 or 30 letters and got no takers. And then when I tried to send out more letters in the sales arena, I sent out another 25 or 30 and I had all kinds of takers. So they wanted to hire me for a sales job. So I ended up being hired by Herbst Russell Pharmaceuticals, which no longer exists. It's part of Sanofi today. But I ended up being hired into sales by the Senior Vice President of Sales and Marketing. And I actually spent 3 years in sales before being promoted into the home office. And in the home office, I did work related to an IV antibiotic. Well, actually in sales, I did work related to the IV antibiotic, including the development of a spreadsheet for costing, which was in line with my degree, a PhD in pharmacy administration. And I did this with a surgeon from Johns Hopkins, and it made my day. And so then I went into the pharmaceutical industry, and I went into the home office, and I started working in the home office. And I encountered many, many, many pharmacists in many different jobs. Some of them were in marketing, some of them were in pharmacy, information, so that they would answer the calls of pharmacists about what the different drugs do, and so on and so forth. But finally, after a career in sales, I gravitated toward research. And I did that for about 20 of my 30 years in the pharmaceutical industry was clinical research. And I did health economics and outcomes research as an adjunct to clinical research. And I did that mostly with Bristol Myers Squibb. I ended up retiring from Bristol Myers Squibb after a career of 20 years. Then after I retired, a dean at a school of pharmacy called me and said, would you come and teach other students about the kind of work that you did when you were in the pharmaceutical industry? So I did that. I was a program director for an online degree at Thomas Jefferson University. I was an associate professor, and I did that for another 6 years. So that's all I have for the preliminary, and now I'll take questions from Alexia.
Thank you, Dr. Jackson. That's very interesting to hear kind of where you started and where you ended up. So I'll ask you, how did you decide that you wanted to pursue a career in the pharmaceutical industry? I know you started with marketing, but how did you get to health economics outcomes research?
Well, it was interesting because at the school facilitated experiences. They sent me on a trip to visit Marion Pharmaceuticals at the time in Kansas City. And I visited there, and I thought it was very interesting. And I didn't know what I want. At first I thought, with a PhD, I could be director of marketing. No, nobody does that. You have to work in the trench before you get to the home office, so to speak. uh, but then I wrote to different schools about potentially being a professor, and and nobody was particularly interested in that. And I guess the lesson there is when you first graduate, you have to work in something that allows you to get a sense of how the job works. You usually don't start at the top. You start somewhere in the lower tier, learn the trade, and then move up.
So what was your favorite job after all these years?
Well, I loved outcomes research. I led the company and when I went to Bristol Myers Squibb, I led the function. So I was the executive director of outcomes research, and I had 25 people reporting to me, and we incorporated outcomes research into the trials that we were doing. So at that time, I was associated with the pravastatin trials. That pravastatin was the second statin approved, and we did 3 big major trials, one in primary prevention and 2 in secondary prevention. And I also worked on clopidogrel, which is called Plavix, and we did many trials with that. If one were to Google my name, you would find all of the publications, and a lot of those publications concern pravastatin, clopidogrel, apixaban was the next one I worked on. I also worked on streptokinase, irbesartan. I worked on Alzheimer's drugs that failed. I worked on depression drugs. I even worked on eflornithine for hirsutism. So I worked on many different kinds of drugs over the years, and I had just a fantastic time doing it.
So I know your branch of research is outcomes research, but and you've talked about a lot of different drugs, but was there a favorite project that you had, or maybe a favorite disease state that you liked exploring those drugs or anything?
Yeah, I think my favorite disease was cardiovascular disease. So I was very familiar with cardiovascular risk. I know Framingham back and forth. We actually went to Canada and worked in the database of Saskatchewan in order to better understand how people with hypertension are at risk of disease. And those publications were published in the Journal of the Canadian Medical Association. So it was a big deal. And through the years, I've been to almost all the cardiovascular meetings. I was there when clopidogrel was announced. I was there when the West of Scotland was announced. West of Scotland was the first primary prevention study, and I don't know if people, I'm sure you people would not remember because you're too young, but at first they thought that cholesterol was a hoax, was a hoax of the pharmaceutical industry in order to sell drugs. And we needed our studies to prove that cholesterol actually benefited people and kept them from getting heart attacks and strokes and serious cardiovascular consequences. So it was, it was. I'll tell you a little story. I worked on a team, 4 people, that put together what was called the National Medal of Technology, and it was an application with the U.S. government for having done something that really was technologically advanced. Well, in this case, our claim was that our studies on pravastatin and on captopril, the first ACE inhibitor, changed the practice of medicine. And we put together a dossier on that, and we filed it, and it was awarded to the president of our company, the CEO of our company, in the Rose Room of the White House by Bill Clinton. So, so it just kind of tells you that even though you're working in the pharmaceutical industry, you can do things that influence people's lives.
That's very interesting. And I like how you brought up the Framingham study. We talked about that a little bit this past year, and also that Jackson Hart study, since it's kind of closer here in Mississippi. So we've dabbled in that a little bit.
Yes. I actually came to realize that in Mississippi, many people have these sites to dig out clay, and they're local sites known to local healers, and they dig out clay, and people eat the clay for a laxative, for a digestive aid, and it's just like taking Maalox or something like that, but it's natural medicine, and it takes place right there in Mississippi, usually down on the they don't call it the shore, they call it the what do they call it when you're in the lowlands of Mississippi next to the Mississippi River?
The Delta.
The Delta. It comes. They do it right in the Delta. They have these spots that are special for really pure clay, and they eat the clay, and it helps their digestion.
You learn something new every day. I didn't even know that. So when you began your doctoral studies, did you think that you'd be where you are now?
No, I did not know. I admire those people who know exactly where they're going from the moment they wake up as a baby, but that wasn't me. I started down the track of really working in a different career entirely. I wanted to be in international business because as a high school student, I had gone to South America, Ecuador, and it had a tremendous influence on me. But I came to believe in both pharmacy and in research through my years in Ole Miss. And my mentor, I should name my mentor, is Mickey Smith. He was the director of my research, and he's just a leading light, and he's the one that helped me gain the skills necessary to perform the kind of research that I'm talking about that got recognized in the White House and so on and so forth.
Amazing.
Yeah.
So you said in your time throughout your career that you've had the opportunity to work with lots of pharmacists. So what career paths are available to pharmacists in the pharmaceutical industry?
Well, pharmacists can work in a variety of career paths. Probably one of the most obvious is drug information. All companies have a cadre of pharmacists that answer questions about the company's drugs to professionals who call in, pharmacy professionals, physician professionals, and they want to know drug interactions, dosages. They even want to know issues related to off-label use, so on and so forth. And drug information pharmacists can counsel other professionals on the best way their drug should be used. And there's a lot of issues that come up in that context. Another path, and I saw many pharmacists got into marketing and ended up working in marketing and going up the ladder in marketing to try and figure out the best way to position the drugs for sale. There are pharmacists that work in the labs that are doing both phase 1 and phase 2 research. even pharmacists that work in discovery, uh, uh, doing discovery research. There are pharmacists that there was another track that I was thinking of. It's just escaped me for the moment. but pharmacists have many paths to take in the pharmaceutical industry. The one thing I would say is that it is very competitive. So a student needs to really study hard, get good grades, and be very diligent, because the pharmaceutical industry jobs, they apply, and the competition is fierce. So the best thing you could do is get good grades and get good experiences.
So do you think the pharmacists who work in the pharmaceutical industry, maybe the labs specifically, like in discovery, do they go back and get a research like PhD degree, or do they perform those jobs as pharmacists with a PharmD?
Well, there are some jobs that you can perform as a PharmD. If you want to advance, and a lot of companies want you to advance, they will send you back for additional research. And the higher you go, the higher you want to go, the better it is to have a higher degree. Because there are lots of jobs at the pharmacist level that are perfectly wonderful to have and do. But if you want to lead an office, if you want to discover new compounds, you usually need advanced work in order to gain a different degree and a different status. There's even that is very competitive. So.
Okay, and maybe around my last question. So I know you also have been a professor. Are you still a professor now? And how has COVID-19 affected your work schedule and your family and different things like that?
Well, I retired in 2017. And in 2017, I was 69. So I am retired now. And COVID-19, I think my wife and I and my family have been very religious about our social distancing. One very interesting thing is that I was due to have my knee replaced. I'm an avid golfer, and I needed a knee replacement. I was due to have that on on March 19th. But then COVID came along, and elective surgeries were put on the back burner, as was our cruise to the Adriatic. We had to cancel that, push that back a year. But I had my knee done on May 19th. And so that's a big difference. That was a COVID related difference. But still, even now, and I go to physical therapy, and even now we're social distancing, and I wear my mask. Where's my mask? Yeah. See, I wear this mask all the time when I go outside. And I believe in people like Dr. Fauci completely. He's a great guy, and in fact, I should say that some of the Bristol drugs that were around, I worked on, and the drugs that succeeded AZT, we had some of them in Bristol Myers Squibb, and I can tell you that AZT was approved before there were randomized controlled clinical trials. And so it's very much like they're talking about the vaccines today being approved before they've gone through complete testing. And the parallels between the early days of AIDS and the early days of this vaccine are very similar. So it's interesting from a research perspective.
That's awesome. Well, I always like to ask our interviewees one last thing. If you could give any advice to maybe a high school student that's considering going to pharmacy school, or maybe a college student who's considering the pharmacy industry, what advice could you give them?
Well, I think the first thing is buckle down on your schoolwork, do your schoolwork diligently. The second thing is to look for opportunities so that you can get experience in the industry. Some experience in the industry. When I was in, I did 2 residencies while I was a student with the US government. I did a residency for 6 months in the Health Services Administration, which used to be HEW, which is now HHS in Washington. And I did an experience in the National Institute of Mental Health. And both of those experiences have served me very, very well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jackson, for joining us today. Everybody, thank you so much for watching. Don't hit like and subscribe, and comment below as to what you want to see next week. We'll see you real soon.